So a few months ago, I tried making Mabel from Gravity Falls out of fuzzy socks. Having a lot of ambition but not a lot of confidence, here's how it went. So first I had to find socks in all the colors I needed. Most of them I could find pretty affordably, but every supposed skin tone sock I bought was too dark or too cool toned for Mabel, so I decided my best shot was dyeing a white sock to match her skin tone. Even though I knew that the polyester socks weren't going to take dye very easily, I soaked a pair in hot coffee anyway just to see what it would do. After letting it sit for about half an hour, I rinsed them out and got a splotchy color that did lightly stain the sock, but mostly washed out. I did do another coffee bath the next day, but again, the results were way too light. So I decided to go out and buy fabric dye specially made for polyester, and I followed the directions loosely, only heating the water and not boiling it, so that I wouldn't get too dark of a color and also wouldn't melt the sock. Overall, I was pleasantly surprised with the amount of color the socks took, and also the evenness of it. After that, I also soaked them in red food dye and water to make the color more warm, like a skin tone. Then I could start sewing the plushie itself. Going into this, I had little to no plan and kind of just hoped it would come together. I knew it was definitely much more complex than the plushies I usually make and might not work at all, but I figured I'd never know unless I tried. So, with that being said, I started by using the toe of the sock to create the head and neck, drawing my shape with a Sharpie, then backstitching on the line I drew, then cutting and turning the shape so that it could be stuffed. I actually had a plan for how I was going to do the hair. So I was going to construct it in two parts, first being everything but the front section in front of the headband. I used a portion of the heel to give more volume to the bottom of the hair and stitched along that line just like with the head. I also added some stuffing but kept it pretty flat. At this point, I compared the hair to the head and decided I needed to make the head smaller to match the scale at which I was going to make everything else. It would be much easier if I could use the entire width of the sock for the sweater, like I'd done with the hair, and so I had to make the head smaller to match with that. After restitching and restuffing the head, I could proceed with attaching the hair to the head. Measuring against the piece, I cut an opening in the hair that I could whip stitch to it, using as fine stitches as possible to avoid fraying. And this is what it looked like. Next, I created the front section of the hair using a flat piece of sock fabric. I could pin this to the face and sketch the hairline I wanted, then backstitch along that line and turn the fabric back over it to create the front of the hair. You can see what I mean as I do it, but I'm actually really proud of coming up with this. Later, I'll cover up these raw edges with the headband. I decided to make the eyes next, so that I would have something to base the rest of the face around. The one that I'm making in this clip ended up being too large, but the process is the same regardless of the size. If you haven't seen it in any of my other videos, you'll see the process of creating these small spheres a million times before the end of this video. To create the bean-shaped head that Mabel and Dipper have in the show, I anchored my thread in the bottom of the head, took a large stitch in the center, and returned my thread to where I joined it, tying it off securely so that the head would stay in that position. Then I stitched on the correctly sized eyes and also created the nose in the same manner, stitching around the small circle of fabric using a large stitch length, then pulling it closed like a drawstring bag and securing it with a few stitches, then sewing it to the head. Then I began work on the body using this bright pink sock. I bought a pair of these individually while most of the socks came in bulk because I knew getting the colors right was one of the most important factors when it comes to making an accurate plushie. The sweater was just a tube that was slightly less than the width of the sock, and I sewed it by machine to save some time. I finished the top edge by hemming it with a long stitch length, which could then be tightened around the neck, and I secured that to the head with a small whip stitch. At this point, I was getting some indications that the plushie might not come out that great, but I decided there was still a lot of time for it to come together. And to finish off the body of the sweater, I just turned and hemmed the bottom edge. The next order of business was the sleeves, which were just two triangles made to be the width of the sock. And I also sewed these by machine. It's quite difficult to sew through this thick, stretchy fabric, and there's probably a sewing machine foot I could buy to help me, but I could also just pull the fabric through the machine and it's functional enough. Then I cut out the sleeves and cut them open along the top and bottom so that I could turn them inside out. Before stitching them to the body, I created hands in the same way as the eyes and nose, and stitched them into the cuffs of the sleeves, making sure to have the raw edge turned inwards. Then I could stitch the sleeves to the body at the shoulders. This ended up being a little thick and uneven, but I'm not sure what else I could have done to create the sweater, save for cutting the socks into sheets of fabric and patterning it similarly to a real sweater. Next I moved on to the skirt, which I used a leftover sock from my sloth video to make. This was the eye mask of the example sloth, not the blue one I made in the video. Can't believe that was over 3 years ago now. Anyway, I sewed the strip of fabric into a tube and turned it in on itself so that there would be no raw edge, and I placed it in between the sweater and the bottom of the neck fabric, which kind of ended up being the core of the entire plushie. And I whip stitched that to the sweater to hold it in place. Then I took a several-month break while procrastinating the legs because I wasn't sure what the best way to make them was. In the end, I just went for it with no plan, as usual. I started with making these 2 tubes, but I had to scrap them because I'd forgotten to flip the sock before starting, and the color on the inside is different than the outside, and also they were a bit thick. After redoing them correctly, I cut ovals from black sock fabric for the shoes and gave them the same treatment as the eyes, nose, and hands before stitching them to the legs. I needed something to sew the legs to inside the plush, and so I cut a piece of sock fabric and stitched it inside the skirt. Then I could trim the legs to size and stitch them to that base, which probably isn't the most secure, but I can't think of a better way to do it. I figured it was finally time to cover up the raw edges and the hair with a strip of pink fabric. At this point, the plushie was looking pretty mediocre, and I didn't see a way of salvaging it, so I wasn't the most careful with stitching this on. It's not that I disliked it, but it would be a lie to say it was as cute as I'd envisioned. I was actually debating on whether to post this video or not, and whether making it was a waste of my time and yours, but I didn't want to paint an unrealistic picture of what making fuzzy sock plushies and sewing in general is. Lots of the time I cut out the mistakes in my sewing videos and my sock plushie tutorials because it's just less confusing and easier to explain, and I plan on continuing to do that, but you know, sometimes it's okay when things don't turn out as you'd hoped. Anyway, I sewed the ears next, which were similar to the feet and the eyes and the rest of those pieces, but I took a stitch down the center of them to flatten them a little bit before stitching them to the head. At this point, I was really giving up, so I cut some felt pieces for the front of the sweater and used super glue to glue them on, not even caring that my pen lines were still visible. And lastly, I used black yarn to add the pupils in the mouth, which was difficult enough for me to stop filming halfway through. And here's what the final plushie ended up looking like. I feel like every component I made was just passable, and so the plushie as a whole wasn't able to come together as I'd hoped. It's also pretty asymmetrical, which, granted, is fair because it's hard to shoot for symmetry when working with such stretchy fabrics. Part of the problem is that the plushie just doesn't photograph well. Like, in person, I think it's got some appeal to it. If you're watching this video close to its release, you can go to my community tab to leave suggestions for what I should make in the future. I bought so many socks for this project as parts of packs, and I'd like to use them up. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.